This is the NHL title belt, which is not only very real, but also happens to be one of the most highly sought after and coveted prizes that the hockey world has to offer. And just in case you're sitting there questioning its authenticity just because you've never heard of it before, here is a clearly not photoshopped picture of Brandon Tanev with it last season that I randomly selected from the countless pictures of the belt across the internet. Okay, fine. Yes, it is made up, but it does at least come from an idea that has been around for quite a while now. I'm not sure of the exact origins, but I at least first came across it as the NFL title belt probably over a decade ago now. And through some Google searching, it does turn out that there have been a few NHL type of versions that have cropped up over the last few years, at least one of which is still tracked on an active subreddit. But those versions weren't really done in the way that I felt they probably should be, didn't go far enough back, or didn't include playoffs and that type of stuff. So I figured, what the heck, how hard could it be to put one together? And, well, little over a year later, here we are. Of course, by now you're probably wondering, and honestly probably have been since the beginning of this video, what this whole NHL title belt thing is and how does it work? Well, basically it's just a crossover between the NHL, which if you're new to this channel, I follow pretty closely and cover here on the channel, as well as, I don't know, take your pick between wrestling, boxing, or UFC, none of which are really my thing to say the least, but the idea of a title belt seemed fun nonetheless, and again, here we are. Now, like I said with some of those other versions of the NHL Championship belt, which, again, this is now the NHL title belt that we're talking about, so clearly completely different and separate things, but none of them really went far enough back, all the way back to the start of the NHL, which, to be fair, the NFL title belt, which is the origin of all of this, doesn't go back to the start of the NFL and just starts at the start of the Super Bowl era, but anyway, I felt like the start of the NHL was the best place to start for a true title belt passed on since the beginning. Now, for those of you that know your hockey history or have watched my videos, you know that there were a couple of teams from that original NHL that had already been around in another pro league called the NHA, but we're just going to start from the beginning of the NHL because, again, it's the NHL title belt, just in case I hadn't already said that enough by now. So that means that we have to go all the way back to the 1918-1919 NHL season, which was the second of the NHL, but we have to get through the whole first season of the NHL to figure out who wins it and gets to start with the title belt, which was the Toronto Arenas winning the Stanley Cup in 1918. And then from there, well, it's pretty simple. Anytime a team that's holding the belt loses to another team in either a regular season or playoff game, so no preseason or exhibition games, they hand the belt to that team that beat them. So, for example, in that first season, 1918-1919, the Montreal Canadiens are actually the ones that end up getting it here after the first game because while the Toronto Arenas were the ones that held the belt coming into the season after winning the Stanley Cup, they lost both of their first two games to Montreal, handing the belt over in the first loss and then Montreal retaining it with the second one. But then on the 2nd of January of 1919, they lost to the Ottawa Senators, the old original Ottawa Senators, and handed the belt to them. But then immediately beat them 2 days later to take the belt back on the 4th, held it for quite a while until losing to the Toronto Arenas on the 21st of January of that year, and the Arenas immediately handed it back to the Senators, who took it on the 23rd, and that just kept going all the way through that regular season, right up until the last game of the regular season was played by the team who was holding the belt at the time, which was the Montreal Canadiens at the end of that season, beating again the Toronto Arenas on the 15th of February. At which point, the belt moves on to the playoffs with the team that had it at the end of the regular season. And if it does make it to the playoffs, then based on the nature of the playoffs, it will inevitably end up with whichever team ends up winning it all. Now, again, using the example of this first season, that did lead to something that I didn't really think about until I was most of the way through this, of the possibility that the way I did it, it could have ended up in one of these early seasons in the hands of one of the PCHA teams that the NHL played for the Stanley Cup in those first few years. Fortunately for me, in all of the seasons where the belt made it to the playoffs, Either the NHL team ended up winning the Stanley Cup, or in the case of the 1919 Cup between the Montreal Canadiens and Seattle Metropolitans, that one ended up getting canceled partway through due to an outbreak of the Spanish flu and was never awarded. But the Canadiens did win the last game that was played, so they're able to retain the belt into the next season, even though, again, there wasn't a winner of that Stanley Cup. So it didn't really end up mattering, other than the fact that the Seattle Metropolitans do have credit for holding the belt 3 times, and the Vancouver Millionaires have credit for holding it twice. But felt no harm, no foul. Again, the NHL ended up with the belt both of those times, so you can kind of just ignore these 2 Stanley Cups if you really want to. Eventually, by 1927, it was only the NHL playing for the Stanley Cup, so these are really the only times where that was even a possibility, and again, fortunately for me, it didn't end up happening. Now, that may still leave a couple of questions. For one, what happens if the team who's holding the belt ties with another team? Something that was still possible into the early 2000s in the NHL. Well, again, a team has to beat another team in order for the belt to change hands. So in the case of a tie, like for example, this tie between the Philadelphia Flyers and Carolina Hurricanes in November of 2003, the belt stays with the Flyers, who were the holder of it, and just keeps on going with the Flyers until they do eventually lose, which in this case, they held on to it for quite a while up until the start of December when they lost to the current version of the Ottawa Senators. And then there's also the question of what happens if the team who has the belt at the end of the regular season doesn't make it to the playoffs. Well, for the 80s and 90s, that wasn't a problem, as every single year the team that ended with the belt at the end of the regular season did make the playoffs, but that's become less consistent over recent years. And the answer is, if a team has the belt at the end of the regular season and doesn't make the playoffs, they keep the belt going into the next season, which again is another difference from some of those other trackers that just say, well, if you have the belt at the end of the regular season and you don't make the playoffs, then it gets stripped because you don't deserve it, which I can kind of understand the argument, but then at that point it becomes more of a single season belt and less of a perennial thing that can continue to be passed on from one team to another throughout history, only by one team defeating another. Now, I'm sure in wrestling, boxing, or UFC, there's rules around what happens to a belt if the holder of the belt gets, let's say, injured and can't fight for a long period of time while they recover, or certainly if they were to retire while holding the belt, I would imagine they would have to automatically pass it on in some way. Wrestling has ways of scripting around that, but fortunately, when it comes to team sports, we don't really have to deal with those issues too much. I suppose if a team were to fold while holding the belt, that would be kind of like someone retiring while holding it, and then it would probably just get passed on to whoever wins the Stanley Cup that year. But fortunately, we haven't had to deal with a team folding since before the original 6, and the closest we would have then is a team relocating, at which point I think the belt would probably just stay with that team and move to the new city with them. Everything else seems to, so yeah, that's probably what would happen there. Either way, we haven't had to deal with the belt being in the hands of a team that either folded or relocated at the time of that happening, so I guess we'll see if that becomes an issue with the Arizona Coyotes here in the near future. Unlikely that they would be holding the belt if it did, though. That said, though, if you have different ideas of how this belt should work, I'd love to hear them down in the comment section, as evidenced by the fact of there being this one that I made and all sorts of at least 2 or 3 other championship belts for the NHL that I saw tracked, and I saw ones for MLB, NBA, and obviously the NFL title belt that started it all. There's all sorts of different ideas about how something like this should be run if it were to actually exist. So I'd love to know what you guys think down in the comment section. And of course, with this being sports in the 21st century, what would the point of all of this be without some stats to go along with it and look back at the history of this belt being passed along from team to team for over 100 years, even if most of them or none of them even knew about it at the time. Well, it probably won't come as too much of a surprise based on how many Stanley Cups different teams have won and how many teams were in the league for large periods of time, that the team that's held the belt the most, or for the most number of games, is the Montreal Canadiens with over 1,000 games with the belt. Now, there's a pretty big drop off of over 300 games to the Boston Bruins. And of course, the original 6 all have a healthy lead on anybody else, before the Philadelphia Flyers come in 7th, having held the belt for 351 games in their existence, which is actually pretty impressive considering it's a large amount more than the next most being the Buffalo Sabres, who managed to beat out all of the rest of those teams that aren't the Flyers from that first expansion in 1967. And then there's some teams like the Vancouver Canucks and current Ottawa Senators who have lost a lot more opportunities at the belt than they've won, and some teams like the current Winnipeg Jets, and even though they've only been around for 2 years, unfortunately Seattle Kraken, who have not held the belt for very long considering how long they've been around. Again, the Kraken have only been around for 2 years, but they've only had the belt for one game. That was early last season when they beat the Buffalo Sabres, and Tanev skated around the ice holding it over his head. Which definitely happened. So then, with only having held the belt for half of a game per season they've been in the league, the Kraken, by times holding the belt per season in the league, are well below the rest of the teams at this point. That having been said, they did join the league as a 32-team league where it's harder to get your hands on the belt or get chances at it in the first place, but it's still well below the next lowest, which is the Winnipeg Jets. And while they've only been in the league for 12 years, at least in Winnipeg, and for the purposes of these stats, I did separate teams from their former locations if they relocated, they've still only held the belt 23 times, which is half that of the Golden Knights, who have only been in the league for 6 seasons. So for Vegas, that's twice as many times with the belt and half the number of seasons played from that of the Winnipeg Jets. And annoyingly, especially as a Kraken fan, does make Vegas the second best team when it comes to number of games with the belt per season in the league, second to the Montreal Canadiens, who do have the noticeable advantage of being part of the original 6 when there were a lot more opportunities to have the belt. In fact, the only 2 teams that have beaten any of the original 6 teams when it comes to number of times with the belt per season are the Vegas Golden Knights and Philadelphia Flyers. As far as defunct or old locations of teams that have been relocated are concerned, the old Ottawa Senators certainly led the pack there by a wide margin. Next was the Minnesota North Stars, and then another big gap to the third place, with 2 teams in the Brooklyn Americans and St. Louis Eagles also being on just one game with the belt in their existence, so the Kraken can pass them if they can have the belt for one more game at least this next season. Either way, beyond that, there's not a lot else that I've been able to dive into at this point, but let me know what you guys think of this. Was this fun, pointless, all of the above? What changes might you make to it? Different ideas that you have? And I'm sure there's plenty of improvements that I could make as far as, well, certainly a presentation and that kind of stuff down the road. But yeah, this will certainly be something that at least appears here and there, at least on this channel, if nowhere else. I might make a, well, not Twitter because that's pretty much dead or at least dying at this point, but maybe a Threads account that tracks this build throughout the season. So look out for that. And yeah, I mean, ultimately, this was just kind of a weird idea that popped into my head, something that I kind of had interest in over the last few years, and eventually just figured, what the heck, I'll put it together and see what happens. I did not expect it to take as long or be as big of a project as it ended up being. Once I was finished, I knew I kind of had to do a video about it. And really, that's kind of where this whole channel started in the first place, was me looking for more content and not really seeing some of the things that I was interested in. So I figured, what the heck, I might as well be the one to make it. Yeah, never really set out to be a NHL or Kraken specific channel. That really just happened because as I was making videos, those were the ones that you guys seemed to be the most interested in. So that's where we took the channel. But while it's the NHL and certainly Kraken off season, and there really hasn't been much going on with either one over the last month or 2 months now, as we're kind of in the middle of the true off season, might as well throw some of these weird, quirky projects in there and see what you guys think of them while we have the time. So again, especially with ones like this, your thoughts are very much valued down in the comment section. And you have made it to this point, thank you very much for watching. If you have liked or enjoyed this video, which if you've made it to this point, I would imagine you must have liked something about it, there are buttons for that kind of stuff down below that help support the channel. And for the second video, if you really want to help support the channel a little bit more, we do have a Patreon set up that, especially for those of you that are here for more of the Kraken R&Rs, there will be a lot of good Kraken R&R type of stuff that is available through that Patreon throughout the course of the season. So be sure to check that out. Link will be down in the description. And otherwise, yeah, stay safe out there. Be good to each other. God bless, and May the Kraken get and hold the belt for the rest of time.